Welcome back to the show. Today I'm titling this episode, The Next Lane. And I'm standing in the middle of the road. I don't recommend you try this at home, but that is the theme of today's show, The Next Lane. Let me share a story. There have been many times when I've been at the gym and I look at the guy on the bike. I do weights in the bike. Look at this guy next to me on the bike, and he's 5 miles or so down the road, 6 miles he's been there. And I kind of get frustrated because for a second, I have to remember that this person started 10 minutes before, 15 minutes before I even got to the bike. And I think sometimes you and I have a tendency to look at the person maybe on this side of you or that side of you and think that you should be where they are, but you tend to forget that they started before you even got out of bed that day. Let me share a story. A company chartered a ship for its top salespeople, and when they arrived at the dock, they swarmed aboard and headed for their cabins. A minute later, one salesman was on deck demanding to see the captain. One of the officers asked if he could help. "My friend has a much better cabin," the salesman said. "I did as good a job as he did, and I want a cabin just like his." "Sir," the officer replied, "the cabins are identical." "Yeah," said the man, "but his cabin looks out on the ocean, and my cabin looks out on this old dock." The man had become so absorbed with playing the comparison game that he became blind to the obvious. The ship would soon be on the ocean, and all the views would be the same. Now, the question begs, I think, for you and I, is have you ever noticed that we're perfectly content until we see what somebody else has? I've done it. I know you've done it. Jean Paul writes, comparing ourselves to others can bring forth feelings of superiority that cause us to feel prideful. How many times haven't you looked at other people around you who don't have what you have, and once in a while your ego gets bloated up, your head gets big, and you think that you're better than everybody else? Well, in the Old Testament of the Bible, in this part of the Bible called Proverbs, there's a piece of a phrase in there that says that pride goes before destruction, and a haughty or a stuck-up spirit before a fall. So to me, that tells me that the more arrogant I am, the more quickly I'm going to fall on my face. Have you ever known people, I won't ask you if you've done it, but have you ever known people who walked into a pole, P-O-L-E, pole, and the first thing they did was what? They looked around to see if anybody saw them walking to the pole? I think you and I have walked into more poles than we have ever shared with anybody else because you and I don't want anybody else to know how stupid we have been in the past. Comparison oftentimes makes us forget our identity. Seeing ourselves as less than somebody else can maybe lead us to feeling inadequate. I can remember many times when I was younger wishing that I was somebody else, or wishing that I had the strengths and the personality style of other people. I'm an introvert, and I've always, at least for many years, wanted to be an extrovert, because extroverts seem to be able to do things that us introverts and shy people struggle with every single day. Well, again, I go back to what the Bible teaches. Now in the New Testament, it says that we're God's workmanship. We're purposely created to be who we are. I think oftentimes also comparison keeps us from fully experiencing joy. It might sound a little weird, but it's often been said that comparison, I think it was Ben Franklin who said that comparison is the thief of joy. Comparison is the thief of joy. There have been so many times when I have wanted cars that my friends have, or maybe I've wanted certain homes that these people have had, or I want certain amount of dollars in my bank account that other people have. Instead of being content with what I do have, let me kind of delve a little bit deeper into my life. There was a time for several years that I would be traveling a lot for my job. I was making a very good income, but I was away from home when my kids were small quite a bit, almost every week for a couple days or a few days at a time. And I look back at that now in hindsight, and looking back at what members of our family have gone through, and I wish I could have rolled back that clock today, and instead of being out there traveling and staying in motels, I wish I could have been home at a decent hour every day. Because sometimes hindsight is 20/20, because I wanted what other people had. I was allowing other people to drive me or motivate me or to push me to do things, i.e. working crazy hours to earn X amount of dollars. Again, I was earning good money, but what was more important? Was the money at the time more important, or was hanging with my kids? Well, looking back, yeah, the money was great. We were able to do things. We were able to build a big house, etc. But I would give anything to go back and be with members of my family all over again. Again, comparison sometimes, oftentimes, is the thief of joy. There's a guy named Tim Hiller. He wrote one time. He says, "Don't compare your beginning to someone else's middle." Again, don't compare your beginning with somebody else's middle, or your middle to someone else's end. Don't compare the start of your second quarter of life to someone else's third quarter. I think you've done it. I know you've done it multiple times. You've looked at people around you, and you, again, I'm repeating, and I will repeat this multiple times, that you look back at them and you realize, man, they are miles down the road, and I'm only not so far. But they got started way ahead of you, and they got started way ahead of me. Well, by the way, it was Mark Twain who said that. Comparison is the thief, or is the death of joy. Comparison is the death of joy. Chuck Swindoll, there was a story in the New Testament of the Bible where Peter, St. Peter, as the Catholic Church calls him, was kind of getting irritated about this guy named John. And John and Peter, among several other guys, were followers of Jesus, the teacher. And Peter was getting so miffed because Peter thought that John had a higher status that Peter had. And Peter was kind of a hyper guy. He was very type A, it seemed, if you read his story. And then what Jesus did was, in essence, my paraphrase of this story, was Jesus told Peter, says, again, my loose paraphrase, Peter, just mind your own business. What's going to happen with John is going to happen with John, and what's going to happen with you is going to happen with you. You and I go down life's road all the time, and we keep looking over at the next guy instead of paying attention to what's going on around us. I mean, how many times haven't you almost hit somebody in front of you because you're paying attention to what's going on behind you or what's going on the side of you? Been there, done that. I tell you a story. I was about 17 years old. I was working in a mall in Columbia, Maryland, and I got off work and I was heading home. So I was at a red light, true story. I was about the third or fourth car back at the red light where I would leave the mall parking lot. And I noticed this cute girl walking quite a ways away just coming out of the mall. And I was looking over at her. I'm still at the red light, looking over, and I didn't realize that while I was looking over at her, my foot was easing off of the brake just a little bit. So as I'm looking, seconds later, I heard the thud. My car had drifted into the car in front of me. Great. 17 years old, not been driving that long. Oh no, I'm in trouble. So I put the car in park. An elderly man came out of his car, the car that I hit. I looked at his bumper, he looked at my bumper, and I told him the truth. For me, the best thing to do is to tell the truth all the time. So I told him the truth. I said, I was checking out this girl over there. He looked over at her, and he said something to the effect of, young man, I was young once too, I understand, no problem. And he got in his car and drove off. What I was saying is sometimes when you get distracted by looking at things that you maybe shouldn't be looking at the moment, it's going to potentially cause you to get into a little bit of trouble. Again, comparison can get you off track very, very easily when you get distracted by other people. Rochelle Goodrich wrote in her book, Slaying Dragons, "Isn't it strange how a lamb can feel like a lion when comparing itself to a mouse, whereas a lion feels like a lamb when measuring itself against dragons?" Again, let me share that quote. "Isn't it strange how a lamb can feel like a lion when comparing itself to a mouse, whereas a lion feels like a lamb when measuring itself against dragons?" Now for me, there is a very fine line between being jealous of the person in the next lane and or using them as a motivation to do things, to push you to do things better than what you're doing them right now. I mean, for me at least, I have a tendency to model and to watch and to learn from people that are much smarter than I am. I think that's a smart thing to do for you too. To model people, maybe in the next lane, maybe around you, maybe in your circle, or maybe you need to extend your circle to learn from people that are smarter than you and or better than you. But it takes a tremendous amount of effort not to cross that line, to cut corners to get where you want to be faster than what you need to. Let me give you another story. I would say I was somewhere between 10 and 13 years old when my father one day got some motivation to go to the local high school track. At the time, it was just my brother and I, so I would say I was probably younger than 13. So he got this, I don't know, this workout bug, this exercise bug going, and I was not exercising at the time. I was overweight, chunky, and he says, "We need to go to the track." So we go to the track, and I remember it was a very warm day, and my brother, a thin kid, always energetic, always outdoors doing things. I still envy him, surprisingly, with this show. I still envy him and his talents here today. So we get on the track, and he starts us off, and my brother, he's 2 years younger than me, and he's just running up a storm. My dad's way ahead of me, and I'm struggling along. So all of a sudden, I got this great idea that I'm going to win this race by cutting across the field, the infield of the track. Then by then, I would be ahead of them as they come around the track, and I would win, in quotes. So I did exactly that. As a child, you do stupid things. So I cut across the infield. I was ahead of them. I cheated. I ran ahead of them. I come across the finishing line. I'm the winner. So by the time my dad comes around, of course, he's out of breath, and my brother's out of breath from running. And my dad said, "You didn't win. You cheated. You're disqualified." And it really, it didn't hurt me by any stretch because I knew what I was doing at the time, and I knew I wasn't going to win legitimately. But I wonder how many people think that they can get through life by cheating and doing things halfway and doing things the wrong way to get ahead. I know you know them. I know I've worked around them and worked in the same office as them. But just please know that those people will eventually get caught, and those people will, in time, get disqualified. So it's really important for you and I both to remember to do the right thing all the time, no matter what. Because when you compare yourself with other people and take the shortcuts in order to get where they are because they've paid the price that you haven't been willing to pay yet, then you're going to end up on the wrong end of that situation. Michael Thomas Ford writes, "Just because your life isn't as awful as someone else's doesn't mean it doesn't suck." His words. You can't compare how you feel to the way other people feel. It just doesn't work. What might look like a perfect life or even an okay life to you might not be so okay for the person living it. You don't know the struggles that other people have. You don't. You assume, I assume all the time there's people around us that have all their stuff together. But I can guarantee you that most people don't have their stuff together. James Dobson is a very well-known author, mostly of books about families and developing relationships and things like that. And he wrote, comparison is the root of all feelings of inferiority. Again, comparison is the root of all feelings of inferiority. The moment you begin examining other people's strengths against your obvious weaknesses, your self-esteem starts to crumble. I can remember in grade school, in middle school actually, in gym class they had these ropes that the students were to climb from the floor of the gym to the ceiling. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I was always chunky, I was always overweight. So for me, and I had no upper arm strength whatsoever, and I could never get more than 3 or 4 feet off of the ground. And there were some of these kids, man, that would just climb these ropes like little monkeys. They would just go up these ropes like, it was just effortless to them. And you can tell to this day, it still bothers me that I wasn't able to climb those ropes. You know, when you start looking at the other people who can climb the ropes around you, you start thinking less of your own abilities. There's a lesson I learned a long time ago, that instead of working to develop or to strengthen your weaknesses, why don't you find areas that you're strong in and develop those for you to be stronger? And that's a concept that I think a lot of people invert. They think that they need to develop areas where they're weak instead of investing the time and the energy and the money in areas where they are already strong, or at least they have a passion to be strong in. Somebody by the name of Amit Kalantri writes, don't compare the size of your roof with the size of the sky. Don't compare the size of your roof with the size of the sky. How many times have you been tempted to gauge where you are right now with your next door neighbor? There's been people that, in fact, I know there's a lot of young people out there who want what their parents or their parent may have, when it took their parent or parents 30, 40 years to get what they currently have. So they get frustrated. So they go into debt. In fact, I know somebody who went out and bought a very, very expensive car because it was offered to them as a quote-unquote good deal. So their car payment for this expensive car is about half a month's rent every month. So not only do they have to have rent money, but now add 50% on top of that for just a set of wheels, a car, a fancy car. Why? But then you have some people that are billionaires who drive very, very old vehicles because they understand what the value of a car typically is. It goes what? It goes down. So why would they invest in something where the value goes down? And I think you and I forget that too, that there are situations and people and circumstances in our lives that we don't have any business investing our time and our energy and our emotion into because it just drags us down. It depletes our energy. We shouldn't compare ourselves with other people. Yes, we can learn from other people. I'm not saying that you shouldn't learn from them, but to compare ourselves with them and envy what they have to the point of being not happy with what you have, I think is wasting years of your life. And if you stop and think about it in your own life for just a moment, you have potentially been so envious and jealous of certain people in your life, and that jealousy has gone on for months and maybe years, that you have really discounted how blessed and how fortunate you really are. I can remember when we adopted our first 2 kids, Rebecca and Matthew. We traveled to Russia in February of 1998 and adopted this little boy and girl. Well, we obviously flew back home to the United States, and within a very short period of time, one of the 2 would hide food in their bedroom because that child knew in the orphanage that they only got food so often and it was never enough, or rarely enough food for them. So this child would stash food in their bedroom just in case. This went on for quite some time because this child compared their former life in an orphanage in St. Petersburg, Russia, with living with a family that loves these kids very much and having enough food that they could ever eat at any time in any day of any year. So her reference point was what was versus what is. The same child, which I just gave away who that was, also would, for a long time, would panic when my wife and I would leave this child in a room, not to lock him in the room by any stretch, but to just walk out of the room. Maybe my wife got a phone call and she left the kitchen while this child was eating lunch, and the child would freak out because they thought that we were leaving the child forever. It took a long time for this child to stop. The point is, it took a long time for the child to stop comparing what was to what is. So let's kind of broaden that idea. Where in your life are you comparing what was from your past? That happened a long time ago, way down the road, way, way back, years ago. And it's impacting you still today. That maybe it needs to be left back in the road. Maybe people who've done you wrong. I'm guilty of that today. As I stand right here today, I'm guilty of still carrying that baggage of what people have done to me, bad things people have done to me and my family over the years. I mean, some horrific things they've done to us. I'm still carrying that baggage. What should you and I leave in the past that's keeping us from enjoying the path or the lane that we're in right now? Because I have a tendency to think that some of the people that have done you wrong years ago don't even remember your name because they've done it so many times to so many other people. But yet we're still carrying those bricks of anger, of rage, of frustration, of jealousy, of envy, of self-doubt. In fact, one text in the New Testament in a book called 2 Corinthians says that one paraphrase says this: I wouldn't dare say that I'm as wonderful as these other men who tell you how good they are. He says their trouble is that they are only comparing themselves with each other and measuring themselves against their own little ideas. What stupidity. And then there's another story that always jumps out at me. In the Bible, in Luke chapter 18, it talks about this religious guy who was watching this poor person come into this religious place. And they weren't dressed very fancy, and they were kind of actually quite poor. And this religious guy, he just started rattling off how great he is. And, I'm glad I'm not like this person because, I have the good clothes, and I've done all these good religious things, and I'm not nearly as poor as this person, and, I'm way better than them. But then what the teacher said in this text, it says that the one who was the poorer of the two, the one that didn't regurgitate a bunch of accolades about themselves, were more honored than the one who thought that they were all that. What I'm saying here in this context is the guy was looking at the other lane of this person who was in the poor lane, if you will, and judging them without knowing their entire story. And I wonder if you and I have done the same thing. We've looked at the person in the next lane, we've judged their story, and we've assumed certain things about them and started talking smack about them, and we don't really have the facts at all about their history, about their story, about how far they've come and the price they've paid to get where they've been and what has happened to them in that journey. We don't know. We don't have the facts. So for us to judge people in a way that's unfair is really the big lesson, I think, for you and I in this episode. That it's tempting to, when we're on this lane, we're going down the lane, minding our own business, going from A to B, and we glance over and look at the next guy in the next lane and want what they have, when we don't know diddly squat about the price that they've paid to get there or all the pain and agony that they've had to get there. You've seen people, hacking down a car on the side of the road or trying to hitch a ride, or maybe they're driving a car that has, dents in it or other stuff that doesn't look very nice. You don't know their story. So when you're on the road of life, consider being a little bit more kind to the people in that next lane. Maybe learning from them, but judging them is probably not the way to go for you and I. As we travel down life's lane, learn from those who can teach us, but maybe don't judge those when we don't have the whole story. Hope you got something out of this episode of this show, and we'll be back real soon with some more ideas that can help you in your life. My name is John Carver, and thanks for watching.